Hi, this is Fabian Trahan, and welcome to Ectophobia Radio, the ParaSanctum podcast. Hi, and welcome back. I'm Fabian Trahan, your host. This is episode 2 of the ParaSanctum podcast, the Christmas tradition of telling ghost stories. This is a fantastic read on both history and traditions originally brought to us, pardon the pun, in spirit, by Colin Dickey, courtesy of SmithsonianMag.com, and was published 3 years ago on December 15th, 2017. The Christmas tradition of telling ghost stories. For the last 100 years, Americans have kept ghosts in their place, letting them out only in October, in the run-up to our only real haunted holiday, Halloween. But it wasn't always this way, and it's no coincidence that the most famous ghost story is a Christmas story, or put another way, that the most famous Christmas story is a ghost story. Telling ghost stories during winter is a hallowed tradition, a folk custom stretching back centuries, when families would while away the winter nights with tales of spooks and monsters. A sad tale's best for winter, Mamilius proclaims in Shakespeare's The Winter's Tale. I have one of sprites and goblins. The titular Jew of Malta in Christopher Marlowe's play at one point muses, "Now I remember those old women's words, who in my wealth would tell me winter's tales and speak of spirits and ghosts by night." Based in folklore and the supernatural, the telling of ghost stories was a tradition the Puritans frowned on, so it never gained much traction in America. Washington Irving helped resurrect a number of forgotten Christmas traditions in the early 19th century, but it really was Dickens who popularized the notion of telling ghost stories on Christmas Eve. The Christmas issues of the magazines Dickens edited, Household Words, and All the Year Round, after 1859, regularly included ghost stories. Not just A Christmas Carol, but also works like The Chimes and The Haunted Man, both of which also feature an unhappy man who changes his ways after visitation by a ghost. Dickens' publications, which were not just winter-themed, but explicitly linked to Christmas, helped forge a bond between the holiday and ghost stories. Christmas Eve, he would claim in The Seven Poor Travelers, 1854, is the witching time for storytelling. Dickens discontinued the Christmas publications in 1868, complaining to his friend Charles Spector that he felt, "As if I had murdered a Christmas number years ago, perhaps I did, and its ghost perpetually haunted me." By that time, however, the ghost of Christmas ghost stories had taken on an afterlife of their own, and other writers rushed to fill the void that Dickens had left. By the time of Jerome's 1891 Told After Supper, he could casually joke about a tradition long ensconced in Victorian culture. If some of these later ghost stories haven't entered the Christmas canon as Dickens' work did, there's perhaps a reason. William Dean Howells lamented in a Harper's editorial in 1886 that the Christmas ghost tradition suffered from the gradual loss of Dickens' sentimental morality. Howells stated in that 1886 editorial that the ethical intention which gave dignity to Dickens' Christmas stories of still earlier date has almost wholly disappeared. While readers could suspend their disbelief for the supernatural, believing that such terrors could turn a man like Scrooge good overnight, was a harder sell. People always knew that character is not changed by a dream in a series of tableaux. That a ghost cannot do much towards reforming an inordinately selfish person. That a life cannot be turned white like a head of hair in a single night by the most allegorical apparition. And gradually they ceased to make believe that there was virtue in these devices and appliances. Dickens' genius was to wed the Gothic with the sentimental, using stories of ghosts and goblins to reaffirm basic bourgeois values. As the tradition evolved, however, other writers were less wedded to this social vision, preferring the simply scary. In Henry James' famous Gothic novella, The Turn of the Screw, the frame story involves a group of men sitting around the fire telling ghost stories on Christmas Eve, setting off a story of pure terror without any pretension to charity or sentimentality. At the same time that the tradition of Christmas ghosts had begun to ossify in the 19th century, gradually losing the initial spiritual charge that drove its popularity, a new tradition was being imported from across the Atlantic, carried by the huge wave of Scottish and Irish immigrants coming to America. Halloween. The Halloween holiday, as we now know it, is an odd hybrid of Celtic and Catholic tradition. It borrows heavily from the ancient pagan holiday Samhain, which celebrates the end of the harvest season and the onset of winter. As with numerous other pagan holidays, Samhain was in time merged with the Catholic festival of All Souls' Day, which could also be tinged towards obsessions with the dead into Halloween, a time when the dead were revered. The boundaries between this life and the afterlife were thinnest, and when ghosts and goblins ruled the night. Carried by Scottish and Irish immigrants to America, Halloween did not immediately displace Christmas as the preeminent holiday for ghosts, partly because, for several decades, it was a holiday for Scots. Scottish immigrants, and to a lesser extent Irish immigrants as well, tried to dissociate Halloween from its ghostly implications, trying unsuccessfully to make it about Scottish heritage. As Nicholas Rogers notes in his Halloween, From Pagan Ritual to Party Night, Rogers states, "There were efforts in fact to recast Halloween as a day of decorous ethnic celebration. Organizations such as the Caledonian Society in Canada observed Halloween with Scottish dances and music and the poetry of Robbie Burns, while in New York the Gaelic Society commemorated Halloween with a séances, an evening of Irish poetry and music. Americans' hunger for ghosts and nightmares, however, outweighed their hunger for Irish and Scottish culture, and Americans seized on Halloween's supernatural rather than cultural aspects. Well, we all know how this turned out. The transition from Christmas to Halloween as a preeminent holiday for ghosts was an uneven one. Even as late as 1915, Christmas annuals of magazines were still dominated by ghost stories. Florence Kingsland's 1904 book of Indoor and Outdoor Games still lists ghost stories and fine fare for a Christmas celebration. She writes, "The realm of spirits was always thought to be nearer to that of mortals on Christmas than at any other time, including Halloween. For decades, these Halloween and Christmas celebrations of the oncoming winter bookended a time when ghosts were in the air and we kept the dead close to us. My own family has for years invited friends over around the holidays to tell ghost stories. Instead of exchanging gifts, we exchange stories, true or invented, it doesn't matter. People are inevitably sheepish at first, but once the stories start flowing, it isn't long before everyone has something to offer. It's a refreshing alternative to the oft-forced Yuletide joy and commercialization, resurrecting the dead tradition of ghost stories as another way to celebrate Christmas. In his Harper's editorial, William Dean Howells laments the loss of the Dickensian ghost story, waxing nostalgic for a return to scary stories with a firm set of morals. Howells tells us in that editorial that it was well once a year, if not oftener, to remind men by parable of the old simple truths, to teach them that forgiveness and charity and the endeavor for life better and purer than each has lived are the principles upon which alone the world holds together and gets forward. It was well for the comfortable and the refined to be put in mind of the savagery and suffering all around them, and to be taught, as Dickens was always teaching, that certain feelings which grace human nature, as tenderness for the sick and helpless, self-sacrifice and generosity, self-respect and manliness and womanliness, are the common heritage of the race, the direct gift of heaven shared equally by the rich and poor. As the nights darken and we head toward the new year, filled with anxiety and hope, what better emissaries are there to bring such a message than the dead? Thank you for listening to the ParaSanctum podcast. This is Fabian Trahan. Have a very happy Merry Christmas and a fantastic New Year. Whole and excerpt portions used here from the original SmithsonianMag.com story by Colin Dickey remain the sole property and copyright of SmithsonianMag.com and are not directly affiliated with the ParaSanctum podcast or the Trahan Radio Network. Background music courtesy and copyright of Lucas King's 1 Hour of Dark Christmas, which can be found on YouTube.